Hi, I'm Peter Jones, Chartered Surveyor, author and property investor, and in this short series of videos we're looking at different property strategies that we can use. And this is video number 4, in which we're looking at HMOs, which stands for Houses of Multiple Occupation. So, a HMO, I would have called it bedsits back in the day. If you've ever watched Rising Damp with rugby, that's how HMOs started out, where you'd have a number of people who each had an individual room and they rented each room separately. Now, over the last 3 or 4 decades, I guess that HMOs have actually become slightly more sophisticated, and there's different levels of HMOs and there's different types of tenants that you can find in HMOs. So we're going to think about how we need to structure our portfolio in order to make the maximum return from our cash. So the first thing we need to understand is our local area, or the area where we want to undertake HMO investing, because not every area is the same. Why is that? Because not every type of tenant is going to be the same, or not every type of tenant is going to want the same type of property. So the type of tenant that you're going to attract largely depends A, upon the area itself, and B, where within your locality you're going to be creating your HMO. So for example, if you know that at the local hospital there's a shortage of accommodation and you're targeting nurses and doctors, then you'll be providing obviously HMO accommodation near enough for them to be able to use it. If you want to buy a property near a town or city centre, you may not know initially who's going to be in your HMO, but the chances are if it's in the town or city centre, it's probably going to be, I don't know, young professionals. You will get an idea of who's going to be in your HMO when you undertake your local research. And by the way, every area is different. So I'm only talking in very general terms. You need to do some specific research to see who's going to go into your HMO. Now there's various levels of HMO. They're not all the same. So for example, at the bottom of the panel we could create a HMO for people who are on benefits. We could create HMOs for blue-collar workers. We could create HMOs for professional people. We could create HMOs for students. We could create high-end HMOs, which are almost like a boutique hotel. And we can probably overlap different strategies as well, because we can do all of this within the context and envelope of rent-to-rent. We'll think about this in a future video. We could also set ourselves up with a HMO which would work for serviced accommodation, which we could do with or without rent-to-rent. So there's many, many different permutations. We need to be absolutely clear as to what it is that we're trying to achieve. Now, one of the big drawbacks of HMOs, although actually you could argue that it's a positive thing, depending upon which side of the fence you're sitting, is that they're heavily regulated. They're heavily regulated for good reason, because they're regarded as being a potential fire risk, and if they're not regulated, they could also become something of a social problem. So the regulations are constantly changing. As things stand at the moment, you would need a licence for a HMO if there's 5 or more people sharing and it's on 3 floors or more. But from October 2018 that is changing, and the number of floors becomes irrelevant. It's just whether you've got 5 people sharing or not as at least two separate households. What does that mean? Well, 5 individuals who are not related, or 3 and 2, it doesn't really matter. If there's more than one family, then it's a HMO and it needs a licence. How do you get the licence? Well, you apply to your local authority and they will give you a licence if they think that you meet the criteria. And the criteria isn't just based around the property, although that's important, but they also look at you and decide whether you're a fit and competent landlord. It makes sense actually to apply for the licence through an agent if you have one, because presumably if you're using an agent, hopefully they're fit and competent, and that will be a great help. So what are they looking for when they're issuing the licence? Well, things like that you comply with fire regs, that you have fire resistant doors, fire doors, that you have smoke alarms, that you have heat detectors, that you have proper means of escape and exit, all of that kind of stuff. What else? Well, they'll also be looking at room sizes, and the regulations around room sizes have become quite strict. I was talking to somebody the other day who's got a couple of HMOs, and I was asking how they're getting on with them, and they were quite despondent because they created their HMO 3 years ago. Since then, the minimum room size criteria has changed, and they cannot use some of their rooms. They're too small, which means rather than having a 5-bed HMO, they're now down to a 3-bed HMO. We need to be careful of this kind of stuff. And by the way, the regulations are constantly changing. And just because the regulations are what they are today doesn't mean they're going to be the same in a year's time, or 2 years' time, or 5 years' time. By the way, regulations across the UK are different as well. If you go to Scotland, for example, they have more exacting regulations than you'll currently find in England. In Scotland, as I understand, I don't do HMOs in Scotland, so this is a bit anecdotal, but I was talking to a buddy of mine who does HMOs in Scotland, and he was saying that the rooms have to be of a size where there is wheelchair access, which he was saying was a little bit galling because his HMOs didn't have a lift or a chair lift, and so actually it was going to be impossible to get somebody in a wheelchair up to that room anyway, but he still had to make sure that there was plenty of room for somebody in a wheelchair. So that's Scotland for you. So be very, very careful, make sure that you know and understand the regulations in your area. Another thing to think about is Article 4. What is Article 4? Well, Article 4 is a planning device which is granted to local authorities by central government, which allows local authorities in this context to be able to regulate the proliferation of HMOs. What happened was that some local authorities felt they had far too many student HMOs and that student ghettos were being created, and so central government gave them the powers under Article 4 to be able to limit the number of HMOs. So how does that work? Well, if they designate an area as being within Article 4, then you have to get a licence and planning consent for a HMO, even if under the normal course of things you wouldn't need a licence and planning consent. So for example, if you had a small HMO, we could call it a minimo, which perhaps only had 4 people, which you wouldn't normally need a licence or planning for, in an Article 4 area you need a licence and you need planning. Now, just because there's Article 4 doesn't mean that you're not going to get planning or a licence, by the way, but it means that the local authority can make sure that you can't just go off and create your HMO. Some local authorities have got like a blanket ban where they've put Article 4, others they just want to make sure that they have the right people operating the right type of property, so you may still be able to do a HMO in an Article 4 area. How are you going to find out? Well, you need to talk to your local planning authority. So the upside of creating a HMO is that the income can be fantastic. At least it's fantastic when all the rooms are rented out. The downside of a HMO is that you will quite often find, depending upon who your target market is and depending upon where your HMO is actually located, that the tenants can be rather transitory. They can come and go quite quickly, which means that you're constantly letting empty rooms, paying fees to agents if you're using agents, and so that can actually limit your cash flow. But if you can actually get a good model where you perhaps have a strong demand in a good area where you can get decent tenants, then it can be a really good little cash cow to have HMOs. The downside of a HMO is that it is management intensive. So my advice would be that I wouldn't even think about doing a HMO unless I knew that within the area where I was going to do HMOs I could find a decent agent. Now this goes against all the received wisdom, I understand that, because we can think about, investment areas, where's the best place to invest. Well, I wouldn't even be thinking that, I'd just be thinking, where do I know of a good agent who is competent at running HMOs? Because actually they're worth their weight in gold. Because it doesn't really matter if you go off and find the best investment location in the world, theoretically. If you cannot manage your HMO effectively once you set it up, it doesn't matter, does it? It's just not going to work. So I would start by finding the right agent and then think about actually giving them some HMOs. That's just my views on it. What do you think? So you need to have the right management. Now, that can be expensive, but the downside is that if you don't have the right management, you're probably going to end up managing it yourself, which some people enjoy. Personally, I wouldn't enjoy it. The other thing that strikes me about that is that if we're in property because we want a passive income, it's not very passive because HMOs can actually be very, very intensive. So where are we going to find our HMOs? Well, as I said, we need to understand the area. One thing which I learnt when I was first setting up my HMOs, I went off to a northern town looking for properties which are suitable to convert into HMOs. And I was looking for a very particular type of property. I wanted a property of the right size, I wanted the right layout and the right accommodation to be able to find basically a three-bed terraced house which I could convert into a 5-bed HMO. How? Because I'd turn the 2 downstairs living rooms into rental rooms. I wanted to make them all en suites. They had to be big enough and they had to be the right kind of corridor space in order for the whole thing to work. And I know that those terraced houses exist because I've got a couple, but in this particular northern town I couldn't find any at all. So short of, sort of building extensions or knocking out all the walls and sort of gutting the properties completely and starting again, which I didn't want to do, I had to move on and I actually had to find another area where the configuration of accommodation actually works. So that's something we need to think about. Finally, let's think about finance, because one of the things which is a great benefit of HMOs is that you probably won't be financing your property using a traditional buy-to-let mortgage. Now, it gets a little bit confusing because I have applied for HMO finance through what was essentially a buy-to-let lender, and we all got ourselves into a right old tizzy about it because the lender didn't understand HMOs and they were trying to treat them as buy-to-lets, and they kept sending out valuers who were used to valuing buy-to-lets, and they were coming back with the most ridiculous figures. So in the end, I did what I should have done in the first place, which is I went to a specialist HMO mortgage broker who put me in touch with a specialist HMO stroke commercial lender who understood what they were doing. Because the whole point of a HMO is it is like a little business. It's a little lettings business in its own entity. And so when you find the right lender, and when you couple that with the right valuer who understands how to value cash flowing property like that, then you will get a commercial valuation which values the property not on a bricks and mortar basis, which is how buy-to-lets are valued, but they'll be valued on a cash basis, on the rental that they produce, which is how HMOs ideally should be valued. And by doing that, I was able to take my little terraced house, which just in round numbers, £80,000 for my little terraced house, £40,000 to convert it into a 5-bed HMO, meaning I spent £120,000. When the valuer went out to value it on an income basis, the figure came back, I think it was at 180. So by the time that the bank took off various deductions, which they did for management, and then discounted it down to 75% loan to value, I was able to borrow out all of the money that I put in. I got out £120,000 having spent £120,000. Can you do that? Well, it all depends on which broker you go to, and it all depends on what mortgage products are in the market at any one time. Just for the purposes of transparency, that was 2 years ago. The mortgage market has changed. Is that product still available? I don't know. But there will be other products out there, so you need to just talk to a good broker who will be able to help you to arrange a similar thing. So if you know what you're doing, they can be wonderful. Although I have my frustrations with HMOs when I have a couple of empty rooms, I'm glad to say that the agents that I have are pretty much on the ball, and so I don't have many voids. But to be honest, it doesn't really matter to me because I put in £120,000 and I got £120,000 back out. Any money that I get out of that HMO is now really creating me an infinite return, which I think is pretty cool. Plus, the value of my asset has gone from 80 plus 40 up to 180 in theory at least. So, would I do HMOs? Yes, with some reservations. I'd want to know exactly what the agents in the area are like so that I wouldn't have to get involved, and I'd want to be looking for an area with good agents and potentially where there are decent tenants. You want to think about where you are on that scale that we're talking about. Do you want to be right at the bottom with tenants on benefits? I know people who make very good money doing that, but it's quite intensive. Or do you want to be near the top doing sort of high-end, almost serviced accommodation, almost boutique hotel stuff? Maybe, but then it's going to cost you more to set that property up. So there we are, a few thoughts on HMOs. Hope you found that helpful. Until next time, here's to successful property investing.